April 17, 1945, the Rhine Valley. Morning mist clings to the ancient German soil as American jeeps roll through the surrendered towns of the collapsing Reich. In the converted gymnasium of a requisitioned school building near Mannheim, 37 German women sit in rigid silence, their Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms still bearing the eagles and swastikas of a regime now counting its final hours. The scent of American coffee drifts through the air, rich, abundant, impossibly aromatic to women who had subsisted on ersatz brews made from acorns and chicory for the better part of 3 years. These were not ordinary prisoners. They were the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the communications auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, trained in radio operations, cipher work, and military protocol. Women who had once directed the flow of battle orders across the European theater, who had maintained the vital communications networks that coordinated panzer divisions and Luftwaffe squadrons. Now they sat on wooden benches, waiting to learn their fate from the victorious Americans. Obergefreite Ingrid Müller adjusts her uniform jacket with trembling fingers, the silver pip on her collar catching the weak spring sunlight streaming through tall windows. At 24, she had served the Reich for 4 years, rising through the ranks of the Women's Auxiliary Corps with the methodical precision that had once been the hallmark of German military efficiency. She had coordinated artillery strikes from bunkers beneath Normandy, had encrypted messages for Field Marshal Rommel's Afrika Korps, had witnessed the gradual dissolution of what the propaganda ministry had promised would be a 1,000-year empire. The war had taught these women to expect order, hierarchy, purpose. The National Socialist system had given them uniforms, ranks, responsibilities that elevated them above the traditional roles of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. They had served not merely as support personnel, but as integral components of the war machine, their skills deemed essential enough to warrant officer training, military decorations, and the respect accorded to those who served the fatherland in its hour of greatest need. But on this April morning, as American Captain Robert Henderson enters the makeshift detention facility, these women face a reality for which no amount of military training could have prepared them. The captain, a former schoolteacher from Ohio whose gentle demeanor masks the steel forged by 2 years of combat across Western Europe, carries with him an order that will fundamentally alter these women's understanding of their place in the post-war world. The great reversal had begun not with dramatic pronouncements or violent retribution, but with something far more psychologically devastating: the quiet dissolution of everything they had believed about strength, superiority, and the natural order of things. The American military government's policy toward captured German auxiliary personnel was designed not for punishment, but for what the occupying forces termed democratic re-education, a systematic dismantling of Nazi ideology through exposure to American values of equality, abundance, and individual dignity. For women who had been indoctrinated to believe in German racial superiority and the natural hierarchy that placed them above the inferior peoples of conquered Europe, the coming weeks would deliver shock after shock to their carefully constructed worldview. They had expected interrogation, imprisonment, perhaps execution. They had prepared themselves for the harsh justice they assumed their enemies would dispense. What they had not anticipated was something far more subversive: kindness coupled with the complete inversion of their former status. Captain Henderson sets down a clipboard and surveys the assembled women with eyes that have seen too much war to harbor personal hatred. Behind him stands Sergeant James Washington, an African-American soldier from Detroit, whose presence alone challenges every racial assumption these women had been taught to accept as scientific fact. The Wehrmacht's propaganda had portrayed American forces as a mongrel army led by Jewish officers and bolstered by inferior races. Yet here stands a black man wearing the uniform of the victorious United States Army, his bearing professional, his rank respected by his white commanding officer. The psychological warfare begins not with harsh words, but with an announcement that strikes at the very core of these women's military identity. They are to be assigned to work details within the American garrison, not as prisoners performing hard labor, but as servers in the officers' mess hall. They will polish silver, arrange flowers, serve meals to the very men who have defeated their armies and occupied their homeland. For Ingrid Müller, the announcement hits like a physical blow. To serve, not to command, not to coordinate, not to fulfill the duties of a military professional, but to serve in the most traditional and diminished sense of the word. The silver pips on her collar, earned through years of faithful service and technical competence, are to become meaningless ornaments as she assumes the role of waitress to enemy officers. The irony penetrates deeper than mere role reversal. These women had embraced National Socialism precisely because it had offered them escape from the limited sphere of domestic servitude. The Nazi Party's emphasis on women's contributions to the war effort had elevated them to positions of genuine responsibility. The Nachrichtenhelferinnen Corps had been presented as proof that German women could serve the fatherland in ways that transcended traditional gender roles, that their intelligence and dedication could be harnessed for purposes grander than Hausfrau duties. Now, in defeat, they were being returned to the very servitude from which their military careers had liberated them. But this servitude carried an additional burden. It was to be performed not for their own people, not within the familiar hierarchies of German society, but for the foreign conquerors who represented everything their ideology had taught them to despise. The first morning of their new duties arrives with the cruel punctuality of military routine. At 0500 hours, these former officers report to the garrison kitchen, where Mess Sergeant Tony Alberti, a second-generation Italian-American from Brooklyn, assigns them their stations. The irony is not lost on any of them. Being directed by a man whose very surname would have marked him as racially suspect under the Nuremberg laws, whose grandparents had emigrated from a nation Germany had considered its weakest ally. Ingrid finds herself assigned to the officers' dining room, where she is handed not a cipher machine or radio equipment, but a silver service set that gleams with the kind of abundance German forces had not seen since before the war began. Each fork, each knife, each serving spoon bears the weight of American industrial might. Solid, well-crafted, manufactured, without regard for the material shortages that had plagued the Reich for years. The silver becomes her daily reminder of the fundamental lie at the heart of everything she had believed. She had been told that America was a decadent nation, weakened by luxury and racial mixing, incapable of the discipline and sacrifice required for total war. Yet here in her hands lies evidence of a manufacturing capacity so vast that even utilitarian objects like mess hall silverware could be crafted with attention to beauty and durability that German factories, straining under constant bombardment and material shortages, had long ago abandoned. As she polishes each piece, Ingrid begins to understand that she is not merely cleaning eating utensils, but confronting the complete collapse of her worldview. The silver service represents something far more threatening to her Nazi conditioning than American military superiority. It represents American abundance, the casual prosperity of a nation that could afford to fight a global war while maintaining living standards that most Germans had never known even in peacetime. The morning of April 24th brings the first full service. The German women, dressed in simple gray dresses provided by the American quartermaster, file into the officers' mess to serve breakfast to their captors. The transformation is complete. Former military communications specialists now carrying coffee pots and serving trays, their professional identities subsumed beneath the universal feminine role of caretaker and server. Captain Henderson observes this ritual with the analytical eye of an educator. The democratic re-education program had been designed by American social scientists who understood that ideology could not be defeated through force alone. The Nazi system had provided these women with identity, purpose, and a sense of superiority that mere military defeat could not erase. Only by demonstrating the falseness of Nazi racial theories through direct experience, only by showing them the reality of American values in action, could their fundamental beliefs be challenged. As Ingrid serves coffee to Major William Peterson, a logistics officer from Minnesota, she notices details that her training had taught her to observe, but that her ideology had prevented her from understanding. The major thanks her politely, treats her with the courtesy due to any human being performing a service. There is no contempt in his manner, no sense of triumph or superiority. He simply accepts her offering of coffee, with the same natural politeness he would show to any civilian employee. This casual equality proves more psychologically devastating than any punishment could have been. She had been prepared for hatred, for the kind of brutal retribution that German forces had visited upon conquered populations. Instead, she encounters something far more subversive: the assumption that all human beings, regardless of their former allegiances or current circumstances, deserve basic dignity and respect. The weeks pass in a blur of silver polish and serving trays, of coffee urns and place settings arranged with the precision that once characterized her military communications work. Each morning brings the same routine: the careful preparation of meals that showcase American abundance, the service of foods that most Germans had not tasted in years, the quiet efficiency of a system that operates on principles of equality rather than hierarchy. Ingrid begins to notice the conversations around the officers' table, discussions that reveal the complexity of American military organization. The officers debate tactics and strategy with a frankness that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht, where disagreement with superior officers could result in court-martial. Here, lieutenants challenge captains, captains question majors, and the entire structure operates on a principle of professional competence rather than rigid adherence to rank. More disturbing still are the casual interactions between white and black soldiers, the easy camaraderie that contradicts everything Nazi racial theory had predicted about American military cohesion. She watches Sergeant Washington coordinate supply operations with the same authority as any German NCO, sees white soldiers defer to his expertise without apparent resentment or racial tension. The silver service continues to gleam in her hands, each piece reflecting not just light, but the growing realization that she has spent 4 years of her life serving a cause built on fundamental lies. The abundance represented by these simple utensils speaks to an industrial capacity and organizational efficiency that the Reich's propaganda ministry had consistently downplayed or ignored. By early May, as news of Hitler's suicide filters through the garrison, Ingrid has begun to understand the true nature of her defeat. It is not merely military, though the Wehrmacht's collapse had been total and inevitable. It is not merely political, though the Nazi state had proven itself incapable of governing effectively even within its own borders. It is philosophical, a defeat of the entire worldview that had given meaning to her young adult life. The silver spoon she polishes each morning has become a symbol of everything the Nazi ideology had obscured. American abundance flows not from the exploitation of inferior races, but from systems of production and organization that harness human potential rather than waste it on elaborate hierarchies and racial mythologies. The prosperity evident in even the most mundane objects speaks to a society that had achieved what the Reich had only promised: the mobilization of an entire population in service of common goals. On May 12, 1945, as Allied forces complete the occupation of Germany, Ingrid serves her final breakfast in the officers' mess. Captain Henderson approaches her as she arranges silverware for the last time, carrying papers that will determine her future in the post-war world. The American military government has implemented a comprehensive denazification program. But for auxiliary personnel like herself, the focus is on re-education rather than punishment. She will be released to civilian life with a certificate acknowledging her cooperation during captivity, along with recommendations for employment with the American Occupation Administration. The irony is complete. The victorious Americans are offering her opportunities for meaningful work that the defeated Reich had promised but never delivered. As she sets down the silver service for the final time, Ingrid reflects on the transformation that has occurred not through dramatic conversion, but through the quiet accumulation of daily contradictions to her former beliefs. Each polished spoon had reflected back to her the hollowness of Nazi promises. Each served meal had demonstrated the reality of American abundance. Each courteous interaction with her captors had revealed the fundamental human dignity that racial ideology had tried to deny. The re-education program had succeeded not through indoctrination, but through exposure to a system of values that operated through practice rather than propaganda, that demonstrated its principles through the thousand small actions of daily life, rather than through the grand gestures of political theater. The Silver Service remains in the officers' mess, continuing to serve meals to American personnel as they begin the long work of rebuilding a devastated continent. But for the German women who polished those utensils during those crucial weeks of transition, the silver had served a different purpose entirely. It had become a mirror in which they could see reflected not the distorted image presented by Nazi ideology, but the simple truth that human worth cannot be measured by race or nationality, that genuine prosperity flows from systems that respect rather than exploit human potential. In the end, the silver spoon that Ingrid had polished each morning throughout those weeks of captivity became the symbol of a larger transformation, the transformation of women who had served a system built on hatred and hierarchy into individuals capable of embracing the democratic values of equality, dignity, and shared humanity. The humiliation they had initially felt at being required to serve their former enemies had evolved into something far more profound. The recognition that true service to human dignity rather than to abstract ideologies, represented not degradation, but the highest calling of civilized human beings. The American officers they had served had unknowingly participated in this transformation, their casual courtesy and assumption of human equality providing daily lessons in democratic values more powerful than any formal education program could have delivered. Through the simple act of being treated with dignity while performing dignified work, these women had discovered that their worth as human beings transcended the narrow categories of race and nationality that had defined their former lives. As the occupation of Germany entered its second phase and the work of denazification continued, the silver service in that officer's mess continued to gleam, maintained now by German civilian employees who approached their work not as a symbol of defeat, but as an opportunity to participate in the rebuilding of their shattered nation. The transformation was complete. What had begun as punishment had become partnership. What had started as humiliation had evolved into hope. The silver spoon, polished to perfect brightness each morning, reflected back not the darkness of the past, but the possibility of a future built on the democratic principles that had triumphed not through force alone, but through the patient demonstration that human dignity, once recognized and respected, becomes the foundation upon which all genuine prosperity must rest.